Hello and welcome to our first advocacy training webinar with Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and the League of Women Voters. This is the first in a series of webinars on how to make change in Augusta and be an effective advocate for the issues that you care about. In this first of our series, we'll be covering who we are, Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and the League of Women Voters of Maine, and our democracy partnership. We'll cover the tactics and strategies that we use to make change in Augusta and ways for you to get involved. So if you're familiar with who's speaking, my name is Anna Keller. I'm the Executive Director for the League and MCCE. And I first got involved in advocacy organizing on the Clean Elections Initiative in 2014, helping volunteers to collect signatures to get a citizen initiative on the ballot. And since then, I've been working on democracy reform issues in Maine, in and out of the legislature for the last 4 years. With me today, I have Sarah Rawlings.
Hi, this is Sarah Rawlings. I'm the Advocacy and Organizing Director for Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and the League of Women Voters of Maine. I got my start in this advocacy work back in 2015. When I was volunteering on the ranked choice voting referendum campaign. Since then, I've done organizing in both a volunteer and a professional capacity, and I've been with the Democracy Partnership since February of this year.
Great. So we're going to start off by just talking a little bit about who we are so that you have the background for our organization and how we function before we go into the meat of how we make change in Augusta. So the League of Women Voters is a citizens organization that has fought since 1920 to improve our government and engage our communities in the decisions that impact our lives. There are more than 800 state and local leagues in all 50 states. And our main league has been around since 1920 as well. So formed from the movement that secured the right to vote for women, the centerpiece of the league's efforts today remains to expand participation and give political voice to all Americans. Maine Citizens for Clean Elections is a newer group that came from the effort of Maine people to pass the first clean elections law in 1996. And since then, we have been working to get big money out of politics and make Maine's government more accessible to the people. In 2018, these two organizations that have been working together and have had similar missions for quite a long time decided to come together to be more effective advocates. So since then, we have had one staff and have been coordinating our policy goals together. And so while our volunteers come to this work as members of one or of both organizations, or are coming today because you're interested in learning what we are doing, we have volunteers who come from different backgrounds, and together we have 7 staff and more than 500 volunteers and members around the state. And there are league chapters organizing locally in Portland, Brunswick, Augusta, the Mid-Coast, Down East, Machias, and Bangor, as well as many members of both organizations all across the state.
So now I'd like to talk a little bit about our mission, how we achieve change in Augusta and in the state, and what it means to be a nonpartisan organization, because that's a really important part of what we stand for as well. So Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, as Anna has alluded to earlier, advocates for campaign finance laws, elections, and government that serve the public interest, both in principle and in practice. So we support measures that increase fairness, inclusion, and opportunity in our politics and promote robust participation by Maine people in their government. The League of Women Voters of Maine is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. And we do that with the support of individuals and foundations that share our mission and our view of the public interest around elections and government. So I mentioned nonpartisanship. What does that actually mean? Nonpartisanship means that as an organization, we do not endorse or oppose candidates or political parties. It means we support or oppose policies because they are good or bad for voters, not because they are good or bad for any political party or candidate. Our members can be members of political parties in their own time. We are passionate advocates for issues, not because they favor one party or another, but because they're in the public interest. We also aim to have broad support for our policies from across party lines. So it's important to remember when we're doing this advocacy work not to burn bridges, because most reforms are going to be fought and refought over and over again. And while that can sometimes lead to frustration and righteous anger, the place for that righteous anger is not in the committee room. Now I want to talk a little bit about our theory of change. So we believe that sustainable change only happens when everyday citizens are active participants in creating change that reflects deeply and widely felt values. It's not enough to win a political campaign or pass a piece of legislation. It's how you win or lose that determines if the change you seek is implemented, lasting, and has stewardship among citizens that government seeks to represent. The biggest obstacle to our vision of a robust democracy is not a powerful and organized opposition, but the cynicism that so many Americans feel after decades of disillusionment with government and the inability to influence the decisions that impact their lives. In this frustration and anger, however, are the seeds of a powerful movement. So through both our policy objectives and our daily organizing, we empower citizens to be active participants in our democracy. Our mission begins and ends with empowered and engaged citizens. This is both our means and our end. Many of our supporters, once empowered, go on to lead their own efforts outside of our work. And now I'm going to turn this back over to Anna, who's going to talk a little bit about how we develop our policy positions and the strategies and tactics we use to achieve success.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So the League has a process for coming to policy positions that allows us to speak with the weight of our membership behind us. And as we're coming together in the Democracy Partnership, it's an exciting part of how we make our action possible. So when we are trying to decide what position we should take on a big issue, we do a study. So during the study, members have an opportunity to examine the facts on an issue along with key pro and con arguments. They're encouraged to discuss the political realities of action on that issue and to engage members of the broader community in the discussion as well. And study gives members the knowledge that means when we take action on an issue, we're really credible. So in recent years, the League has conducted studies on ranked choice voting. We adopted a policy position in favor of ranked choice voting in 2008. We've also studied political action committees, how primary elections should be held, and we're currently starting a study on the citizen initiative process. And these studies give us a broad picture of where we stand on issues. When it comes to thinking about the specifics of those issues, a lot of that discussion happens in our advocacy committee. And I'll talk more about the advocacy committee and how to get involved with that later on in this presentation. I also want to address a little bit about who speaks on behalf of MCCE and on behalf of the League, and on the distinction between us as an organization and what you as an individual can do. So when we have a press conference or when we deliver testimony in Augusta, the person who will speak on behalf of the League is either our elected board president or someone who is designated to speak on behalf of the League. Sometimes that is a staff person, sometimes that's a volunteer, and we'll usually debate in our advocacy committee who is the best spokesperson on an issue. If you're not speaking on behalf of an organization, you can speak as an individual, and that is really, really powerful. And when you're speaking as an individual, I want to emphasize that you bring your own full opinion to the work, and that means that even if you don't agree with a league policy, you as an individual have every right to go have that opinion be heard. So moving on, I want to speak a little bit about the strategies and tactics that we use to make change in the Maine legislature. When we're talking about the Maine legislature, normally to pass a bill, you need support from a majority of the House of Representatives, a majority of the Senate, and the approval of the governor. There are exceptions, constitutional amendments that require a larger vote, or what you do if the governor vetoes a bill. We'll be talking much more about the details of that legislative process in our next webinar. But as a broad overview, assuming that we need to get the support of House, Senate, and governor, how do we do that? There are four main tactics that we use, and the first piece is simply educating lawmakers. Our issues can sometimes be pretty obscure and not always something that legislators know much about. Or conversely, sometimes they think they know everything about elections because they won an election after all. And then our work is to provide context and show them how laws need to account for unusual circumstances that they might not have ever encountered. We can bring examples of how laws may differ in other states and where we can draw on that experience. And when a bill comes up that touches on our issues around democracy reform, we can deliver testimony either supporting, opposing, or sometimes when we don't have a clear-cut position, testifying neither for nor against on the bill, but providing context for the lawmakers. So it would be a great world if there were always clear policy answers and lawmakers always did what we recommended as soon as they understood all of the facts. But that's not the world we live in. And they're also elected to listen to their constituents. And so this brings us back to our theory of change and to our theory of how we have power in Augusta. There are lots of ways for constituents to make their voices heard. Because you elected this official and they need you to keep voting for them, they have an interest in listening to you. The most effective method is talking to your legislator in person, either through lobbying them in Augusta, and we'll be talking much more about that, or by meeting them while they're home in their district. You can also call, write, or email them. We also will bring in allies who can speak to how a law will affect particular groups of Mainers that a lawmaker might really care about, or who can mobilize more constituents. And finally, the media amplifies all of these efforts, helping us to educate lawmakers and the public and making it easier for constituents to get involved. So we will also use tactics like stories in the press, or letters to the editor, or opinion pieces in papers, radio, TV, and those are also great tactics. I want to give a little bit of background on a couple tactics that we're not going to cover in this webinar series. So citizen initiatives are obviously a large part of Maine politics these days. Sometimes the legislature won't pass a law, even though we know that lots of Maine people support the idea. And in that case, we can take it to a citizen initiative. That's happened lots over the last few years, including in ones that we've been involved with, the 2015 Clean Elections Initiative and the 2016 Ranked Choice Voting Initiative. Another tactic that I also want to touch on briefly is protest. And protest in all of its different forms is a really powerful method. People showing up in person in the streets, sometimes that draws media attention and helps get a message out. Sometimes that demonstrates that the number of people who care about an issue is pretty large. And as long as all of these protest tactics are nonviolent, they're all part of the democratic process. But they're not a part of our day-to-day work in Augusta. So we're going to put those to the side for the moment. I also just want to mention that what we don't do ever with the League and MCCE is electoral work. So as an individual, absolutely, your vote is a powerful tool, and you deciding to vote or not vote for a legislator based on where they stand on issues and telling them that, that's really powerful. We as an organization, however, don't endorse or campaign for or against candidates. And that's because we want to preserve our nonpartisanship and our ability to work with people of all parties and backgrounds. So if we were to endorse candidates, we believe that that would weaken our ability to be nonpartisan. So we will never tell you who to vote for. That is a personal choice that you have for yourself. So Sarah's going to speak a little bit about how we put these tactics into practice with an example from the last legislative session.
Great, thanks, Anna. So as Anna mentioned earlier, some of these issues that we talk about can seem kind of obscure, and we're giving you a lot of information today, sort of in the abstract. So what I want to do right now is kind of drill down and give you a concrete example of the work that we do and how we achieve these successes. So we're going to talk a little bit about a case study here. This is a piece of legislation from 2017. It was LD 300, and I'll explain what that means. So in terms of these strategies and tactics, how do we put them into practice? Well, in 2017, a legislator introduced a bill to get rid of clean elections for candidates for governor. We as an organization strongly opposed that bill. And just as a side note, LD stands for legislative documents, and all bills get an LD number. Maine Citizens for Clean Elections took the lead in this effort, and the League supported that advocacy. So at the time, we thought that we could get a majority of members of the House to vote against this bill. And the issue, as I said here, was that we were in opposition to the bill that had been proposed. So we figured we could get a majority of members of the House to vote against the bill, but the Senate was controlled by Republicans, and many Republicans, as well as some Democrats, were skeptical that clean elections for governor was actually worth the money. Therefore, our work was focused on convincing senators, and especially some Senate Republicans, to vote against LD 300. So how do we do that? Well, Anna talked about some of these tactics, so we'll get into a little bit more detail. The first step, of course, is educating lawmakers. So while it can sometimes feel a little scary to talk to legislators about issues we care about, it's important to keep in mind that lawmakers are not experts on every issue on which they have to take a position. And so oftentimes it's up to citizen advocates like you to educate them. And one of the ways that we do that is through committee testimony. So in the case of LD 300, staff gave testimony on behalf of Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, and then a League Advocacy Committee volunteer also delivered testimony. So in addition to giving testimony, there are other tactics that we use to reach and influence legislators, as Anna alluded to earlier in the presentation. And perhaps none of these is more important than showing lawmakers that the public cares about this issue. And just to step back for a moment, talking about committee testimony, obviously not going into a lot of detail about that today, but there will be more of a discussion on that particular tactic in the next webinar. So again, one of the most important tactics we employ in our advocacy work is to show lawmakers that the public cares about these issues. And in order to do that, we oftentimes will have supporters come to Augusta to bring that message directly to legislators through grassroots lobbying, through attending public hearings, and again, through giving testimony. In the case of LD 300, we also reminded the legislature that Maine people had voted twice to include the governor in the clean elections program, and that stripping that out was going against the will of the people. In addition to going to Augusta and having in-person conversations with legislators sitting in on committee meetings, we also had hundreds of Mainers call and email the legislators to tell them to vote no on this bill. We provided folks with a few talking points, and then volunteers provided encouragement to constituents when they made these phone calls and gave contact information for their legislators. We knew that a few key senators would make the difference in this bill, particularly Senate Republicans who had themselves run for office using clean elections. And so we reached out specifically to Mainers in those districts and encouraged them to talk to their legislators. And we do that oftentimes through phone banking. We will have volunteers come into our office And again, reach out to constituents in particular key districts, asking them to in turn contact their legislators. Moving on now, again, to engaging the media. Very important. The media can play a critical role in raising public awareness, in encouraging more Mainers to speak out, and in influencing legislative action on a particular issue. For example, the Portland Press-Herald wrote an editorial supporting our view on LD 300, which helped to amplify the voices of advocates and bring more public attention to the issues of threats to clean elections funding. And of course, as Anna mentioned earlier, we also encourage our members and our supporters to write letters to the editor, because it can be very impactful for folks to see a letter that, you know, their friend or neighbor wrote about an issue that they're passionate about. And then again, involving allies sort of being the last piece of this strategy. So in our efforts to protect clean elections, we also thought hard about what other voices those key legislators were particularly likely to listen to. One important voice was Peter Mills. Peter Mills was a Republican who had run for governor as a clean elections candidate and could speak to other Republicans about why it was a good idea and not only a program that helped Democrats. So Peter Mills then delivered testimony, and in the end, we won, and the bill was defeated by a vote of 20 to 14 in the Senate. So that means we had bipartisan agreement. And you can see in this list, which is called a roll call, or a roll call vote, that Senators Searway and Davis, for example, were Republican senators who joined with Democrats to preserve clean elections for governor. So finally, outcomes and takeaways from this particular case study. So as we noted earlier, some legislators may be especially important to reach for one reason or another. Perhaps it's because they're on the committee that takes the first look at the bill, or at times when the parties all vote together, a legislator who might not vote with their party is very important. We also particularly look at legislators that have a stake in the issue at hand because of how it affects their own future campaigns. So as we noted earlier, some folks who run as clean elections candidates but may not necessarily show support in the legislature, these are the kind of folks we want to reach because they have a direct stake in the issue. So that said, all legislators are important because of the role they can play in convincing their colleagues, in shaping consensus, or in championing a particular bill. So therefore, whether your legislator is a swing vote or a solid supporter, you can play a role in working with them. So now I'm going to turn this back over to Anna, who's going to talk a little bit more about how we organize and what our advocacy committee is all about.
Great. So there are so many ways for you to get involved with our advocacy work. And depending on your particular skills and interests, your level of time commitment, there is really a role for everyone. And so we've mentioned a few times the advocacy committee, and how it works is we have subcommittees that will meet on the 5 main areas that we work on: voting rights, money in politics, voting methods, election integrity, and good government. And so in our advocacy committee, we will debate the details of policy over the course of this fall. We've been looking at what bills we want to propose in the upcoming legislature, thinking through the strategies around those issues, doing research, reaching out to national advocates who have background for us, and coming up to a consensus of what we're doing. And during the course of the session, the advocacy committee is where we're going to have conversations about which bills are coming up, how we need to write testimony about them, all of those details. And so the advocacy committee is open to people who are interested. You don't have to have a lot of background on any of these issues. We do provide training even beyond these webinars on how to get involved. We'd encourage you to try out coming to Augusta with us up for a day, or reaching out to us to get connected to one of these subcommittees. to see what it's like, and then be able to join our full committee. So some other ways to get involved that are a little less intense, and I should mention the advocacy committee meets once a week throughout the legislative session. We don't have every person attend every meeting, but it is probably the most time-consuming of the ways to be involved. Some other important aspects of the work, though, our lobby corps are the folks who are on the spot in Augusta. So some members of the lobby corps may follow a particular committee or an issue and try to be a regular presence there, getting to know the legislators, reporting on what gets said, and making sure the legislators keep our positions and the public interest in mind. And the volunteer lobby corps is supported by our staff, like Sarah and I, and by our lobbyist, Bob Howe, who is a professional who can orient and support you in that work. So when often the process in Augusta is only tracked, though, by those professional lobbyists, having members of the public as a steady presence in Augusta is really key and helps us stand apart for legislators. For important hearings or our big lobby days, many more people will join us in Augusta on a regular basis. And so we'll be talking much more in future trainings, including a future webinar in this series, about how to be an effective lobbyist in person in Augusta. And in our first lobby day on February 14th, we'll also be doing on-the-spot training about how to effectively lobby. Another way to be involved is to be on our rapid response team email list. And with that, we'll let you know important updates about what's going on in the legislature. And that's how you know when it's time to call your legislator, and we'll send out the alert and provide you the information you need to be effective. So if you want to follow what we're doing and get involved in, around the most important votes, being on the rapid response team is a great way to do that. As Sarah alluded to, our phone team is also really important. And we'll call key supporters in key districts, ask them to call their lawmaker, get more people involved in the process. And so, for example, last year, over 2/3 of the people that we asked to leave a message for their lawmaker to support clean elections funding said yes. For a lot of people who aren't following the issues closely or seeking out ways to get involved like you are, this outreach is so important. When they're asked, they're excited to get involved. And those calls can make a big difference. One of the things that really shocked me during the first legislative session that I was working in, I had a legislator say that he had had 7 people call him on a bill. And that 7 people never call me. I didn't know much about this. I didn't really care either way, so I figured I'd better vote the way those 7 people called me, because if that many had called me, I'm sure a lot of other people cared about it. And I was sitting there thinking, 7 people? Okay, well, great. We could get even more people to call you next time. It really makes a difference. Not on every legislator every time, but it really often does. Finally, I want to speak a little bit about what you can do in your own community to support our work. So some of the most effective ways of reaching lawmakers is by sitting down with them in person in your own district, getting coffee, having a meeting, either one-on-one or bringing together your friends and neighbors to meet with them, to talk about the issues. Those conversations can be so fruitful and really show those lawmakers that people in their own communities care about the issue, are following it, want to be engaged. And so, especially if you're someone who thinks, I don't know how I would possibly get to Augusta on a regular basis to do this work, don't despair. You can have a really big impact in your district. So that's all in the abstract. I want to just mention a couple examples of how some of the people that we work with on a regular basis get involved in the work. So Jolene on the left there lives in Rumford, and she really cares a lot about clean elections. She was a clean elections candidate herself at one point. And so Jolene will come to Augusta once or twice a year. She's spoken at a press conference for us. As you can see, she's an enthusiastic person, great at getting other people excited. And she also wrote an op-ed for us once, an opinion piece for the paper. And so over the course of a couple of years, she's had a really big impact and had her voice be heard. Chris on the right there lives in Portland and has been a really regular member of our phone team. He will come in once a month or so and call the other volunteers in districts where we need to do outreach and help them clearly understand the issues and make it easy for them to get involved. And I don't have a picture, but I also wanted to mention what it's like for someone on our advocacy committee. So Gina lives in Belgrade. She is the chair of our voting rights subcommittee and has, over the course of a couple of years, really educated herself about voting rights, automatic voter registration, how that impacts different communities in Maine, particularly low-income people. And she will help us with organizing the bill tracking around these issues, research on the policy, and helping other volunteers understand those issues. And so Gina, I remember the first time that she stood up to lobby in Augusta and was so nervous, she has really become a great advocate. And I think is an example of what is possible if you're interested in these issues to become a really powerful advocate yourself. So that brings us to the end of our training today. Talk a little bit about what's coming up next.
Great. So as we mentioned, this is the first in a series of advocacy volunteer training. As I mentioned earlier, we've given you a lot of information, and I know that can maybe feel a little bit overwhelming, but this was really intended to give you a broad overview of how we kind of get going on this work. So all of our advocacy webinars have been recorded and are available for viewing on our YouTube channel. So if you go to www.youtube.com and type Maine Citizens for Clean Elections in the search bar, you can find those videos. So the next webinar, which is taking place on December 3rd, talks in more detail about how a bill moves through the legislature. We have another one on December 17th, which digs more into lobbying and grassroots communication. And then beginning in January, we'll have a series of webinars talking specifically about our policy priorities and our legislative agenda for the coming legislative session. So the bills that we're going to be introducing and looking for support for, we will give you more of the information and the background on those policy issues so you can get involved in areas that are of interest to you. So we're really glad that you were able to join us today. We welcome any follow-up questions or comments, and of course, as Anna and I have both mentioned, we really encourage folks to get involved in whatever capacity works for them. So to learn more about our work or to get involved, you can email us at info@mainecleanelections.org. And thank you again so much for joining us. Have a great day.